So let's jump into the session itself. So today's topic is let's talk about growing your sponsorship revenue. Not surprising that this is something that a lot of people are interested in, including me, because I do sell sponsorships on my newsletter. We've been on a pretty rocky road the last 12 months or so. The economy still seems to be doing well, but we're seeing lots of reports of publishers seeing a dip in demand in advertising, both on the programmatic and direct sold business. We see a lot of newsletter creators and publishers who were relying almost wholly on paid subscriptions, who are trying to get into the sponsorship space because they see it as a way to diversify their revenue. So there's just a lot of interest about, and a lot of these people, they're journalists, they're writers, they don't know how to pitch advertisers, how to explain their value proposition. So they want to get smarter about this. So in order to speak on this, we have some really experienced guest experts on it. First, we have Kelly, is it Dorogi? How do you pronounce your last name?
Yes, Dorogi, like pierogi.
Okay. And so you are the business development and operations manager for Paved, which is, it's a number of things now. It's known primarily as a newsletter sponsorship marketplace. I know that you also work with publishers to do some direct sales. I know that you're also, I don't know if you've officially launched it, but you're working on a piece of tech that is like allows newsletters to do kind of self-service ads where they can just give the advertiser a link and then they can go and book the ad and upload their credit card information. So a lot of things around newsletter advertising. We have Jesse Watkins. He's the co-founder with Ryan Sager of Who Sponsors Stuff, which does a number of things, but mainly it's basically it does a lot of things, but among them is it has a database of who sponsors, like I think hundreds and hundreds of different newsletters. Like your data entry analysts analyze all these different newsletters every week, and every time there's a new sponsor, you put it in your database, and you also include, I believe, the contact information for that sponsor, so that someone who subscribes to your service can then reach out and try to book those same sponsors. And lastly, we have Dave Hanley. He's the chief revenue officer of Advertisecast, which was a company that he co-founded to focus on helping podcasters find advertisers. It was recently acquired by the podcast host Libsyn, and he's continuing on his role there, working to grow Libsyn's advertising podcast network. Welcome, everybody. So let's just jump into it. I like to always start with a kind of a broad question for all of our guests. And, one thing I think that's top of every publisher's mind is, are we in an advertising recession right now? Obviously, there were a few months there where there was like a very strong dip in advertising revenue. And I think a lot of publishers were hoping that it was just a temporary blip while brands were trying to see what was going on with the economy. But it's been going on so long now that it doesn't seem like a temporary blip. It seems like this is a sustained sustained trend, where nearly every publicly traded company, and those who will talk openly about it, are seeing this dip in advertising. So I'd love to hear each of our featured guests just kind of briefly their opinions on what they're seeing in their data with their sponsors and stuff like that. Jesse, let's start with you. You probably have the most holistic overview of what's going on in the newsletter ad marketplace. Are you seeing anything that's indicating that it's getting harder for newsletter publishers to sell advertising than it was maybe a year ago?
Yeah, so there's a few pieces to this. Just as an overview, so we're tracking 350 newsletters across a variety of industries. So we cover general reach, finance, tech. We're confident that we have a good understanding of any new sponsor entering the newsletter space with our tracking. With that said, we're seeing continued sustained new sponsors in the space. We're seeing anywhere from 15 to 20 new sponsors on a daily basis entering the space. With that said, on the consumer front of things, we're seeing a lot of performance-based advertisers. So as far as like revenue goes and the grind, it's a lot more of a grind right now.
Yeah, and I'm noticing that a lot. A lot of potential sponsors that are coming into my inbox lately is they keep on saying, "How would you feel about, an affiliate deal versus us paying your standard rates?" So that's definitely, yeah, and that's something you see during a recession, a deeper focus on ROI at the moment. Marie, you're nodding your head. Are you seeing that kind of activity as well?
Yes, I receive a lot of requests with affiliate marketing, but I don't think it's very profitable depending on the content creation. So I don't like this approach.
Yeah, and I have some similar thoughts about how well they work for newsletters versus an SEO optimized website, where people are coming in with more intentional, decisions to buy something. Kelly, what are you seeing in your marketplace in terms of the advertising demand sectors where you're seeing advertising demand? Especially, you've been there, I know, for over a year. Are you seeing like variations in demand based on a possible advertising recession we're in now?
Yeah, definitely. And similar to what Jesse said, it's not really that we're seeing less sponsors, less advertisers come through. If anything, they might be increasing a bit, but with that, the budgets are way smaller. They might be more focused on our ad network where they can, bid and work with smaller numbers rather than getting a flat fee sponsorship on our marketplace. So the number of advertisers hasn't slowed at all. But yes, the budgets are smaller. They want to do the ad network, definitely performance driven way more now than last year. So similar to his findings.
Dave, what about you? We've definitely seen some upheaval in the podcast market over the last year or so. Spotify canceling a lot of those podcasts and ending a lot of those big ticket deals with celebrities and stuff like that. There's some, there's some discussion of a market correction going in that. What are you seeing on the demand side for advertising?
Yeah, I think in a nutshell, things were super hot for, look back 2 years and it's like, money was flowing. Some deals were getting done that weren't exactly rooted in the ability to make a profit. And so right now you're seeing that correction also at a time, I think, where the market is definitely a little bit softer. But there are different things that I think that are contributing to the slowdown in podcast advertising. Number one, if you look back 2 years ago, a lot of the companies that were advertising were VC-backed unicorns. A lot of those companies are kind of struggling. And right now, a space that was built upon, direct response is in the same time shifting over to brand. Brands are coming in CPG companies, larger holding companies doing those buys and managing that for them. They're looking for different things than perhaps direct response advertisers that kind of built the space. At the same time, there's also the emergence of programmatic. So there's a lot of good things going on at the same time as a kind of a slow market. So I think what's happening is that it's just not growing like it used to. I think the podcast space is still growing, but it's just at a more reasonable rate. And I think it is one of the few media channels that is, kind of still, still growing. Definitely, like you said, a lot of these non-commercial based deals are starting to go away. Some of the companies that maybe weren't running a profitable business are starting to go away. Buyers are being, a little bit more careful in terms of looking at the performance, and maybe something that might have passed before in terms of performance is now not making it, not getting renewed. And then what we're seeing also is that I think podcast buyers are getting a little bit tired of the whole, just the same old, hey, let's get a 60-second mid-roll. And they want, people start thinking out of the box a little bit. Hey, how about a sponsored segment? How about we do a 360 deal that has podcasts and social and this and that, or, just different ideas that are going to kind of cut through the noise. So that's kind of what we're seeing in a nutshell right now.
That's interesting. Yeah, I do have some questions further around about programmatic versus host read, permanent ads and stuff like that. And also the 360 deal, because one of the biggest, the greatest upside of podcast advertising is that, you have an incredibly engaged audience, but then the downside is because they're listening to it passively while they're doing other stuff, they're not necessarily wanting to click on links or go to a website right then. So the idea of, you can advertise on my podcast, but then let's do a follow-up link within the newsletter so you can actually, drive that engagement or stuff like that. That's what you mean by those 360 deals.
Yeah, exactly. We're definitely seeing that. And the form that generally takes is an advertiser will go on a podcast, test. They see really good results. And then they say, hey, what else can we do with that creator, right? Do they have an email newsletter? Do they have social? Do they have, some other channels that we can work on? And I think the other thing that's really helped in terms of just like brands assessing the performance is that attribution has come a long way. So in the old days, when I first got into this space in 2017, there was no such thing as attribution. It's like, use promo code Dave and save $20 off your first order, right? Like very imperfect. The attribution tools now, there used to be like one provider, now there's like 7, and it's getting cheaper and cheaper. In some cases it's free. So I think that's definitely helped in terms of moving the needle on podcast advertising too.
Kevin, do you have a question? You unmuted yourself. Ramona, you work with IndieGraph, which specializes working with local publishers. Have you noticed something within like the last 6 to 12 months in terms of pullback in terms of advertising or anything like that?
I would say I agree with the idea that there's still people out there, but the overall budget is they have less money and they want more, more for less. And so I appreciated the comments, the free quest, because we get that quite a bit. Well, I really want to be part of it. And then the conversation goes, well, what kind of budget do you have? Well, I don't have any. Well, then we have a conversation about how this whole journalistic new wave has to flow. So it takes a little bit longer, but I think there's still people there, but overall, yeah, they want more for less. That would be my observation.
And then Allison piped in on the chat. Our publishers work with a lot of small businesses and community orgs. They are definitely not as open to spending on digital advertising right now. Allison, did you want to add anything to that?
Yeah, just kind of echoing what Ramona is saying. I think a lot of really small businesses see digital advertising as a nice to have, and they don't really consider it a part of their core marketing strategy, if they even have a marketing strategy to speak of. So like Ramona mentioned, we spend a lot of time educating potential advertisers on the value of advertising with our publications. And so those conversations are definitely getting longer. And then it just seems that there's a lot of people being very cautious with how they're spending money. I think there's a lot of people who are very concerned about what this year is going to look like in terms of income and all that fun stuff. So there's a lot more work we have to do on the front end to close those deals.
Nice. Thanks for adding that. So I want to throw a question to Jesse. So what trends are you seeing in terms of who is spending on newsletter advertising right now? What kind of companies? And then, you did mention that that you're seeing more affiliate deals, but like there's been, I think, a pullback in tech. It seems like tech seems to be going through some kind of recession. I've seen these, I'm not an economist, but I've seen these theories that instead of one big recession, we're going to see sector-wide recessions where parts of the economy are really healthy and like the service and travel industry is doing really well right now, supposedly, but tech is having a pullback. What are you noticing in terms of where you're seeing a lot of like growth in advertising categories?
Yeah, a big one right now, like a lot of the tech newsletters kind of pivot over to like AI coverage. And then we've seen like a ton of new AI sponsors in the space. So like on the AI tech front, I think there's continued sustained growth. If I'm looking through like right now, like our most recently added sponsors, lots of consumer stuff, home goods, and then a lot of B2B investing, AI, crypto, but lots of AI growth right now.
Yeah. That seems like a big bubble. It's not that I doubt, I've kind of opined this in my newsletter a little bit, but it's not that I doubt that AI has a lot of growth ahead of it and is going to be revolutionary, but there just seems so many companies that are just rushing into it. And it's just going to be a huge washout when a lot of those companies end up failing. But it seems like there's money to spend on advertising in those spaces right now.
Yeah, especially the B2B angles. I feel like we see a lot of AI newsletters pop up overnight, right? Like one viral Twitter thread, all of a sudden you have a 50K, 100K audience.
Yeah.
The issue there is this audience is going to be very passive, consumer facing, and it is like a bubble. So it's a niche interest bubble, but anybody that's building out in like B2B AI, like very niche specific, like healthcare AI or finance AI, those I think have some staying power.
Yeah. Kelly, what are you seeing in terms of demand, in terms of like product categories and stuff like that?
Yeah, not to keep copying Jesse, but AI, so many AI newsletters have just been being submitted on the platform, and we're seeing a lot of that. In terms of demand from the advertiser side, certainly some there, but also definitely investing, personal finance. We're seeing a lot of real estate stuff, but yeah, a lot of B2B as well. We have seen way more sort of B2C newsletters pop up in the past, probably since the past year that I talked to you last. But very heavily investment, finance, real estate, things like that.
Yeah, we heard Dave talking earlier about the podcast industry is making its transition from, the first 15 years or so it was focused on direct sold ads, and now it's moved into like more brand advertising. Like on the newsletter side, it seems like, even obviously it's not a new medium, it's one of the older mediums on the internet, but in terms of a lot of brands waking up to the potential, it still seems early. How much education still needs to go on, like for your sales teams at Paved, and about the value of newsletter advertising? Is it still mostly direct sold ads, or are we seeing a lot of brand advertisers enter the mix?
Yeah, there's definitely a big part of education that comes along with it, not only from the advertiser side, but also in the publisher side, and just kind of guiding them and helping them, in terms of pricing and what works best and things like that. So there's both sides of it. And then in terms of, direct sold and branding, it's I would say we're seeing more branding stuff pop up, honestly. But yeah, when our sales team is kind of going out to try to get these advertisers, it's definitely, have you considered newsletter sponsorships as a part of your larger media plan? Here's why it is one of the most effective ways to get your brand out there. Yeah.
Yeah. Jesse, are Fortune 500 companies popping up in your database, or is it still all direct sold?
They do. I mean, there's branding places, Fortune 500, and then any of the big lobbies are always spending. I mean, we are tracking like all of the Morning Brew verticals, which could have larger CPG companies, as well as like any of the Industry Dive or Axios newsletters. So we do see the larger brands in those.
Yeah. Dave, in terms of like the type of advertising for podcast, obviously programmatic's becoming a really big. I find those ads really annoying. I like that they're in the very beginning of podcasts, because I have my as soon as I start playing a podcast, I have my thumb ready to start skipping ahead of those like the Ringer podcast I listen to, and the Vox Media podcast and stuff like that. What is the value of direct sold host read still? Because that was always the pitch of advertising, is like, there was this parasocial relationship with podcasters, and that's what made the advertising so effective. And then there was also this pitch on, your ad will live on the podcast forever, so people will hear it years from now. Is that still like a value? Like, are your sales team still selling those kind of direct sold permanent ads, and using that kind of like, this is a parasocial relationship, this will live on the podcast forever?
Yeah,
is that
absolutely.
Still,
I mean,
is that still in the sales?
Like today, if you look at last year, probably 80% of our revenue was still like host read ads. Now the concept of living on the podcast forever, that is kind of going away, because there's a lot of dynamically inserted ads now, whether that means dynamically inserted across the whole catalog of episodes or on a specific episode for a set number of days or a set number of impressions. So that is kind of transitioning. But with that being said, as you mentioned, programmatic, that's growing quite a bit faster than our host read business. And last year, our programmatic was like maybe 20%. This year, it's going to creep up to probably 35% of our business, and both are still growing. So it's just growing a lot faster. And what's interesting is everybody who is early in the podcast space loves the host read ad because, let's be honest, it works and it converts, and it's the host leveraging that relationship with their listeners. But if you're Procter and Gamble, you don't necessarily want to be like risking your job on some crazy host saying something wild about whatever, diapers or something. So they like the concept more of controlling the messaging, controlling the actual delivery. Like, they don't want an ad there forever. They'd rather have it in for this period of a campaign. And so I think that's why a lot of them are gravitating towards either things like run of network, produced ads, or programmatic, like actual programmatic buying through their demand side platform. And I think the other thing that programmatic has done is it's opened up a new set of advertisers. So previously, in the early days of podcasting, you really only wanted to advertise if anybody and everybody could buy your product. So it's like nationally or even globally available. Today we're seeing a lot more like, hey, we can actually do geo-targeting now on programmatic. So if I'm only in, I'm a brand that's in like, 6 different states. Okay, well, I can run a campaign like that because I can actually geo-target it, as opposed to the old days where it's like, hey, you're in 6 states. Well, you're going to waste, whatever, 80% of your impressions on people that can't buy your product anyway. So it's kind of opening up new, opportunities for sure.
Yeah, probably not. I doubt any like hyper local businesses that are just like a mom and pop shop are doing any podcast advertising. But if it's a decently sized region, like I feel like, the IP addresses give you sort of an idea of where people are at any given time, but it's not a perfect science. So it has to be a little bit broad. Yeah,
exactly.
Mignon, are you available to talk, or are you doing? She might be doing something else and not can't. Okay, I was going to ask her questions about host read ads and stuff like that. Okay, moving on. So this is a more kind of logistical question. Jesse, you maintain not only a database of contact or of sponsors, but you also have like a searchable database of the contact information for sponsors. For a lot of people on this call who mainly deal in subscriptions and want to move into sponsorships, they don't know necessarily who to reach out to, what their pitch is going to be. Who is typically the person in the organization that someone should reach out to?
Yeah, so usually anybody that's controlling the marketing budget, the way we pull contacts, we have 2 contacts for each brand. It was kind of my process, so it depends on the type of company, but usually a growth marketing manager is sort of the title you're looking for, especially anything in that kind of direct response or, scaling kind of VC space. Growth marketing manager, director of growth, VP of marketing could work as well.
Yeah. And so like obviously you're going to be having a cold pitch, but do you find that like a good strategy is to kind of like glom over, not go after the ones who don't do newsletter advertising, but focus on ones who already do, because they're already they already understand the value proposition. So they've bought an ad on newsletter X, so they're probably more likely than the average brand to buy on newsletter Y.
Correct. That's a big part of the reason we built Who Sponsor Stuff the way we did. It started as an internal tool I was selling across maybe 15 different publishers and a ton of different niches like tech, finance, consumer general reach. And something I always did was found the conversations with somebody that's already advertising in newsletter is it's a lot quicker of a conversation. They understand newsletter, they understand the value prop. So that's a lot of the thinking behind why we track in newsletter and provide that data to sales teams.
Assuming that maybe not everybody can afford access to your database. So one thing that I've noticed that I'm doing, and I'd love to hear your opinion on this, is like, obviously I read a lot of newsletters in my niche. So what I did is I created a Google spreadsheet, and every single time I'm reading a newsletter in my niche and I see an advertiser, I then just open up that spreadsheet and just throw that advertiser and where I saw it into the spreadsheet. Do you think that would be a good rule of thumb of anybody on this call, is pay attention who your competitors' advertisers are, and always keep track of those in terms of potential pitches?
Absolutely. like I said, that's what I was doing to back up Ryan. And I started at a company called Ladders, and I was running all of the brand partnerships there. And we scaled everything up from the ground up, starting with 0 advertisers. And that's what I was doing. I had a spreadsheet and also a Slack channel. Another good thing to do is if you're on looking at advertisers all the time, is kind of hacking your Instagram feed. A lot of the advertisers that are going to be direct response in newsletter are also have their paid social spend on Instagram. So when you're browsing and prospecting a lot on the computer, you scroll through your Instagram feed, and that's also a good way to prospect for additional sponsors.
And in terms of email addresses, do you think that people should, if they don't have access to a database like yours, have you seen people like testing out potential emails in the BCC? Like you can usually kind of guess what an email address is, or trying to connect with them on LinkedIn, or what's kind of the hack that people should be using?
Yeah, so there's a few there. When pooling email addresses, something I always like to do, and with brands that are launching, a good thing to do is to Google the brand and then look for a press release. So like marketing said in quotes, and then the year. And sometimes you'll get a direct quote from whoever placed the ad and their email at the bottom of the press release. If that doesn't work, and I know from a lot of what we're hearing feedback from clients, Google's being really rough on cold email outreach right now. So LinkedIn, a lot of our clients are LinkedIn first. So going to LinkedIn is the primary route. LinkedIn's always a good route in.
Yeah. Jennifer, you had a question. You're currently on mute.
Yes. Hi, I'm trying to get my video here. Thanks. I just have a question about audience size. There it is. About audience size and what folks are looking for. Jesse, I actually saw Who Sponsors stuff a few years ago, but I felt like the numbers weren't anywhere near what you were had listed there in terms of like our circulation or our reach. And so just kind of curious, like what now are people looking for audience size? Because I'm also hearing that there's also a sort of quality over quantity conversation. And I don't know if that's just for web or if that's trickling into, newsletters and small media outlets. So just what you all are seeing about that. Thanks. Oh, and I'm working on launching a music publication. We're actually doing print. I know it's weird, but web, and there are a couple newsletter products that are about like what's going on in the industry. And it's a little bit of a B2B, B2C hybrid, kind of targeting that creator economy sort of folks. So people who are in the music business in some way, whether it's like individual creators or they're producers, venue owners, engineers, that kind of thing. Thanks.
Yeah. I'd love Jesse for you to answer this question. I'd also love to hear from Kelly about it. And then I have a variation of this question for Dave a little bit later, but Jesse.
Yeah, first, that's such a cool build, like the business of music, and especially like capturing that creator angle on it, I think is a really interesting build. So excited to see that play out. As far as sizes go, it is quality over quantity. Like right now, you want open rates, I think should probably be like 40 to 60% range is pretty expected from an advertiser as far as a strong engaged newsletter audience post MPP. On the consumer front, newsletters in that 50K to 100K range are struggling a lot with performance. Once you break through over 100K consumer facing, its branding plays a little bit more. And then on B2B, we see people monetize successfully with audiences as small as like 2 to 5K, depending on the niche and engagement.
Kelly, what about you?
Yeah, I would agree. A lot of sponsors will come to our platform and they want to try out a bunch of different newsletters, within their category. So, sometimes they'll want to go bigger, sometimes they'll want to do smaller, but they're definitely looking way more at, who the audience is rather than maybe the size of the audience, who they are, and then, the performance that you're going to give them before they buy your spot. So if you say they're going to get this amount of clicks, then they're going to be happy with that, and go with that. But yeah, I would say it's certainly, if you have lower subscriber count, but your clicks are, percentage is higher, they're going to go with that over reaching a million people, but no one's actually going to see it. So
I'm always a little bit hesitant in giving, average click data for sponsors because it just varies so much. Because depending on how good the advertiser is for your newsletter and how good their copy is, there's just such a large range of clicks. And I feel like,
yeah,
I don't know. It's hard to really even. It's like, well, it depends on how good your creative is in a lot of ways. I feel like it's unfair to put that on the newsletter creator for how many clicks they're going to get sometimes.
yeah. So totally see what you're saying, and kind of what we do there to try and help with that is, take the past 10 that you've done, find the
Yeah.
average number of clicks, then lowball that number just to, a little bit, just to make sure, feel safe about it. But also we encourage all of our publishers to, there's a window period that we have and sort of a timeline that we have on the platform, so that when the advertiser submits the creative to them, we really encourage them to look at it, edit it, rewrite it in your tone of voice, ask them to edit it to just make it as, make it as good as they possibly can make it, that what their audience actually wants to see, make it as native as possible, make it feel like a part of the newsletter. Because that it helps a lot. Not every publisher wants to do that, but the ones that do see better performance, we find a lot of advertisers like it because they're like, yeah, sure, if it'll perform better and you want to write it, fine, go for it.
Yeah.
So that helps a lot as well.
One thing I always do is I always offer to get on the phone with the advertiser to give them advice based on what, my audience reacts to, and they can take that advice or just do their own thing, but I at least give them that option so I can at least guide them towards creating better copy. And then if they turn in the copy fast enough before the newsletter, I can have time to give them a little feedback and stuff like that. Ramona, you said that in the chat that you've been using Instagram for lead gen. That's something never would have occurred to me to use Instagram. How are you using Instagram?
Well, I think basically with the small publishers that we support, it's more having that conversation with the publisher to say if you already have a social presence, who's already following you that has potential that you can, they have already made a connection with you. So now it's on you to go and sort of mine that connection and see who's there. And I think, but this is a huge thing about capacity too. This is also speaks to copy and what type of copy is submitted. And then you want to make it better. But if you're a small publisher, you're writing the stories and putting it up and creating the newsletter. And now you're supposed to be an ad manager and you're going to do like it just becomes this whole thing. But yeah, I would say a social presence, and then taking the time to figure out who is already following you, and then look in there for connections that could who would then be willing to kind of support your newsletter or advertising on a larger field.
Yeah, same thing for the newsletter itself. Is like if you're operating in a niche, then the brands that operate in that niche are likely subscribing to your newsletter. So doing a search within your newsletter of your list of the domain of the different advertisers, you might find that people who work there are subscribed to your newsletter, and they might, even if they're not the point of contact for ads, they might be a better warm introduction to that person. So maybe reaching out to them, especially if they're opening every single edition of your newsletter, that could definitely be a good strategy as well. Sam, you had a question.
Let me come off mute. Thanks. What's up? What's happening, everybody? Nice to meet. I'm really enjoying this conversation. Just to give a little context. Yeah, for sure. Yeah. So I media entrepreneur. I founded a marketing agency and then launched a couple different media properties. One was not too far off from Jennifer, but music business podcast focused on music industry. And then more recently co-founded a company called NFT Now, which became a very prominent kind of Web3 media publication. I'm curious how models around establishing pricing for these niche kind of publications. Obviously, there's no one size fits all approach, but when you do have this kind of niche in-demand audience for various advertisers, I'm curious how you go about establishing price points for advertising packages that are kind of played to more of a premium model versus just what a standard CPM could be.
Dave, you want to take that to start with?
Yeah, sure. And I'll kind of address maybe another question I saw in the chat with regards to audience sizes for podcasts. What we're seeing on the host read side of things is generally the appetite for a host read ad kind of kicks in around 20,000 downloads an episode, or give or take, 100,000 a month if a show is like weekly, right? That's about the same number. And that would be, keep in mind, for your typical like CPM based podcast advertisers, like your DR, HelloFreshes and BetterHelps and companies like that. With that being said, the big caveat is, as you mentioned, Sam, like this niche, maybe it's B2B, maybe it's a very specific niche audience, that doesn't apply. It's like if you have, 500 dentists listening to your podcast, well, that's worth a lot to some people, right? And honestly, I don't think there's any rule of thumb that you can really even use to come up with pricing on that, because it varies by advertiser. Like, what is their average customer worth, right? If you have some, insurance podcast that, some software companies advertising on, and they land one deal that's worth $2 million, like that's worth a lot. So I think it's very custom, and the rules don't apply when it comes to that type of niche.
So just a quick follow-up question, Dave. Obviously it's very hard to get to 20,000 downloads, and there are some like really, podcasters who are in a niche who have hyper engaged audiences that but only maybe even my podcast, like I have a lot of valuable listeners of my podcast, but if you combine my audience, I'm only getting like 2,000 downloads / streams an episode. What's your advice there in terms of pricing and approaching an advertiser? Because it can't be just CPM based at that point, right?
I think the best approach that I've seen in terms of, kind of using you as an example, Simon, would be, you've got the podcast, you've got a newsletter, you've got other things to offer. I think the best way to approach that is kind of that like 360 or kind of multi-channel type of deal. Because the beauty of that is you package it all together. It's the same audience, you're doing different kind of tactics, but really it just kind of like obfuscates what the CPM is or should be, or whatever. It's like, hey, you get all this stuff and here's the price. And it's very difficult for an advertiser to like, okay, what am I paying CPM wise here? And I think the discussion comes more around, here's the audience, here's some successful advertisers we've run with in the past that are similar to you, that were looking to access this audience. Because from my experience in, B2B, it's like, it doesn't really matter what you're paying. It just matters, what are the results? And nobody wants to go out on a limb and like make some big bet for, whatever, 20 grand to sponsor some newsletter or podcast, et cetera, if it's going to result in, nothing. They want to know that somebody before them has already done it and they're not taking, a big risk.
Yeah. Laura, do you feel like we answered your question? Okay. She gives us the thumbs up. Tanya, are you able to come off mute, or do you want me to ask your question for you? Ask away. Okay, let me read Tanya's question. How much are you guiding the page being linked? I find myself recommending sponsors link to blog posts or new feature releases. Open to hearing your experiences on this. Yeah, Kelly, I may be interested in hearing your perspective on this. Is like, I always tell advertisers, if you have a case study or a really good piece of content, that's going to get higher clicks than just a generic kind of call to action to use your product. Like, here's a case study of how this brand used X product to achieve Y results. Like, do you think that is a better performing ad usually?
Yeah, definitely. We definitely see the more, thought leadership, educational, like providing value type ads doing better than just, buy this product, unless it's like a very much CPG type of thing or a deal or whatever it may be. But yeah, definitely leaning, especially with newsletters, people are opening those to read the content and to, gain information on whatever it is they're interested about. So yeah, certainly agree with you on that.
Jesse, what are your thoughts?
Yeah, definitely agree. Anytime the publisher can take most of the ad copy themselves and write it in their own voice, a lot of our publishers do that. Like, that was a big thing for Morning Brew early on, was like delivering really great ad content and delivering for the advertisers. So anything you could do to help make that process better just helps your newsletter revenue grow too.
Yeah. James.
Yes,
sorry.
Oh, Simon, I was just going to add something. It's very similar to what we recommend on the podcast advertising side for like B2B brands.
Mhm.
Like as you can imagine, let's say that insurance example I gave, I use that because I used to be selling software to insurance companies. Let's say you have a call to action that's like, hey, come to our website, sign up for a demo today. Maybe a campaign generates 1, 2, 3 of those. Maybe it turns into something for the advertiser, maybe it doesn't. But if you have a call to action that's like, hey, download our white paper on the top 10 trends that, insurance CIOs need to, be aware of today, maybe you get like 30, 40, 50 of those. And the value of that versus like 1 or 2 or 3 demo signups to the advertiser is a lot more, even though it might result in the same amount of, things at the bottom of the funnel.
What about dedicated ad sends? I feel like I have mixed feelings on this on the newsletter side and the podcast side. Every now and then you'll see them kind of give over the content to the advertiser to, just have a dedicated email sent out to their list that's just about that, content around that advertiser. Same thing on you even see this on the podcast side as well. Like sometimes you'll run an entire episode of somebody else's podcast on your feed, stuff like that. Is that a faux pas? What do you think about that? Jesse, starting with you.
Yeah, so I'm a big fan of the dedicated email product at Ladders. Part of it is know your audience and like you don't want to burn your audience with just ads. But for us at Ladders, like our daily, I was running 7 days a week. So once that inventory was full, it was really create additional like revenue driving products. And for us, we were sending 4 dedicateds a month, and the rate on that dedicated was 10x my rate on a daily. So. Wow. Yeah, when I found like if I was selling a daily for like 3K, like the dedicateds were 35. And
wow.
Once I found partners that like worked well on the daily, like performance was, unusually strong. Okay, audience is, resonating with this brand. Let's roll out a dedicated with them. For a lot of brands, you do have to be very careful. Like brand integrity is like a big part of it. You don't want to spam your audience with advertisements, but the right partnership, the right fit, it could be a serious revenue driver.
Kelly?
For us, it's kind of a mixed bag. It's basically just whatever the publisher wants to do and is comfortable with. I will say that, the ones that do provide the dedicated option and want to do that are, way more involved in that process and know what it's about and are selective with who they accept, reject, things like that. So I think there's a level of, attention that is paid when a dedicated send happens that will help with performance and everything like that. I don't really think there's anything wrong with them or think one's better than the other. I think it just, again, it kind of like Jesse said, depends on newsletter audience and if they're doing it right.
Dave, what about on the podcast side? I know I get annoyed when I accidentally download a non-episode of a podcast.
Yeah, I think, Simon, the biggest place that's used in the podcast world is really podcast promoting on other podcasts to grow their audience. So, for example, one of the biggest advertisers in the podcast space is Amazon, who has a bunch of podcasts, under their Wondery brand. And what they do is they do something called feed drops, where it's essentially, let's say I've got a true crime podcast. They're coming out with a new show that's true crime. I'm going to drop a full episode and say, hey, everybody, great new podcast, on true crime, give it a listen. And they'll actually play either a partial or a full episode. I wish I was getting 10x the CPM as I was getting, like Jesse's getting. We're getting probably like 2 to 4x on those feed drops. They do convert really well for the advertisers, but same thing. Like you just can't, if you're a show that puts out 4 episodes a month, like we say, do 1 per quarter, because your audience is going to be like, oh, another feed drop. That's not, what I want to hear. You can't do too many of them, or else it will kind of alienate your audience a little bit. So be selective and actually do ones on shows that you would recommend to people, not just any random, podcasts.
Yeah. So James has a question and he asked me to read it because he has a small child in the room. Spotify announced they plan to do auto-generated host-read ads so that big name host or whoever could seemingly voice the spots, but in a dynamic and targeted personalized way. Would that be a game changer for podcast publishers to be able to do practically any ad as a host read via some auto-gen AI type setup? So I think I read that news as they would actually clone the voices. It wouldn't just be that like they'd be reading a bunch of ads and then targeting it, that like the like Bill Simmons was given as the examples. He wouldn't even actually read the ad. They would just type in the ad copy and then use his AI auto-generated voice. Dave, do you have an opinion on this?
I mean, I read a LinkedIn post from one of the direct response podcast agency people on this like a week ago, and he said something to the effect of, from the same people who, ruined podcast advertising by bringing in dynamic insertion, they're going to ruin the host read ad by, doing it through, synthetic AI voices. I mean, I think there are some cases where this could be interesting, but I don't see like a lot of advertisers are not necessarily going to buy into, hey, it sounds like Bill Simmons, but it's not really. It's like some synthetic voice, because you can always kind of tell right now. It's not perfect. I think there are some things that Spotify can do that other people in the podcast advertising space can't really do, because Spotify has first party data. They know if I'm signed up to Spotify as a male or female, or my age category, or where I'm located, type of thing, where we only have IP address and like what type of app you're using to download the podcast. You could do things like, hey, you're using a different synthetic AI voice, whether somebody's like in a certain region of the United States. Hey, they're in the South, let's use a different accent versus somebody that's, in New York or something. But I don't see it as a big game changer. I see it as just kind of like a feature necessarily of, potentially what we can do.
Great. So we're entering the final 9 minutes or so. So if you want to ask a question, now is a great time to answer it. Also for the guests, the featured guests, if you are interested, no pressure, but if you're interested, you could leave your email address in the chat for people who might want to follow up about your products or services going forward. So I have a question for Kelly and Jesse, and it's a little bit about ad format. What are you seeing in terms of, I see some newsletters offering like classified ads where it's like a one-line type ad versus one advertiser per newsletter, and then ads at the top versus in the middle. What do you, if you were launching a newsletter today and you had 50,000 followers, how would you actually design your advertising offerings in terms of where the ads go and what kind of ads you offer? Jesse, let's start with you.
Yeah, so I'm a big believer of like do the basics really well. So starting like, if you can't fill inventory on just like your primary sponsorship, I don't think there's a lot of sense to like continue adding different slots. Additionally, when you go to an advertiser with a primary and a secondary at launch, secondary is a lot cheaper. They're going to tend to just opt for that cheaper option.
Yeah.
So I would really build out a primary ad slot with logo up top, and then the second piece of native content in the newsletter, kind of those standard assets to start. And then you could get into like secondary and tertiary, which would just be link post, sponsored links more so than an additional ad slot.
Yeah. So Kelly, let's say you're launching your I don't know what your passion is. Let's say it's your basket weaving newsletter. What kind of ad product are you going to design for that newsletter?
It's actually exactly my number one passion. No. Yeah. So, I mean, similar to Jesse, I would, depending on the length of the newsletter, if it's super long, I would say do 2 in there and see if you could do that. But towards the top, they perform better. So I would do 1. I would make it towards the top. I would make it as native as possible. I would make it native. So if your newsletter is all text, you make it text. If you have an image, do an image of the same size, fonts, things like that. It's just, again, it's as, if you can make it, the ad be a part of your newsletter in a way that it's not really recognizable as an ad, that's the best way to do it.
Yeah. One thing I just started experimenting this week with sponsors is when I send the email out, the ad is at the top. So the people who are receiving in their inbox, it's going to be the first thing they see when they open the newsletter. But then after I send the newsletter, because I'm really into optimizing the web version of my newsletter articles so that they do well on SEO and social media, I go in and I take the ad and I put it in the middle of the newsletter for people who are reading it on the web, just so it's creating a slightly better web experience for people who are landing on my newsletter on the first time and maybe considering subscribing. So that's how I'm kind of playing around with it right now. Dave, in terms of let's say programmatic aside, if you're selling one post-read ad per podcast, where would you put that ad versus you see people putting it in just right at the front, so as soon as they hit play they hear an ad, versus doing an intro and then right before you get into the meat of it, that's right where you insert the ad, and then you get people who put it in the middle or even at the end? Where would you put that ad?
Yeah, I mean, the highest demand from a host read ad perspective is definitely a mid-roll, and that is defined as like, honestly I forget the exact numbers, but it's like within 5% and 80% of the podcast episode. I think that's the number, it might be a little off. But that's the highest demand spot. In terms of longer shows that have, say, room for like, say, 2 or 3 mid-rolls, we always recommend not stacking those in the same ad break. Rather, hey, if you've got an hour-long show, maybe you put one at 15 minutes and you put one at 30 minutes, just one ad per break. When it comes to pre-rolls, we always recommend, if you can, do in-content pre-rolls. So as opposed to like, when you, like you said, Simon, you hit play and it's like an ad for Geico. Well, put that after the introduction where it's like, hey, everybody, today we're talking about X, Y, and Z. Then you've got an ad. And then from a programmatic perspective, like you might as well add post rolls because nobody cares, the show's done at that point. So there's kind of different formulas for different shows, but we always look at each case individually and say, how are people consuming the show, how long is it, and look at the ad loads. Because obviously one of the things we've tried to be really cognizant of is like, some people will come to us and say, hey, I talked to so-and-so network and they said they could make me this kind of money, and I go, that seems like a lot. They said, yeah, we can put 8 ads in here. And I'm like, well, your show's 40 minutes. That's not a good idea, right? So it's like, there's always that push and pull of like, we want to make money, but we also don't want to alienate the audience. So you kind of find that, that middle ground.
Yeah, I feel like if you do it at the beginning, there are so many podcast consumers who are just completely trained at this point to have their thumbs at the ready to fast forward.
Yeah.
Versus if you have it after the intro, by that point they put the phone back in their pocket.
Yeah, you're already washing the dishes and you don't want to dry your hands off and grab the phone and hit skip, right?
So as long as it's not too annoying, they'll at least listen to that one ad.
Exactly.
Okay, everybody. Well, we are reaching the end of our hour. Thank you so much for joining. I really loved. Go ahead and stop the recording. I really loved the level of discussion we had here, and